Hi, I'm Adeline. 2 weeks ago, my sister Miranda stood up at my baby shower in front of 30 family members and friends and declared that I was too irresponsible to raise a child. She suggested that maybe someone more capable should take custody of my unborn daughter before I could damage her life. The room went silent, champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips, as my 8 months pregnant body absorbed the shock of public humiliation from the person who was supposed to love me most. What Miranda didn't know was that her own carefully constructed life was about to crumble in ways she never imagined. What happened next exposed decades of secrets, shattered family loyalties, and proved that sometimes the people pointing fingers are the ones with the most to hide. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of my baby shower started with a kind of October sunshine that made Portland feel almost magical. Golden light streamed through the windows of our craftsman-style home in the Hawthorne district, illuminating the nursery that my husband David and I had spent months preparing. Soft yellow walls, white furniture, and a mobile of tiny elephants that would soon welcome our daughter Emma into the world. David had left early for his shift at Portland Fire Station 21, kissing my forehead and reminding me to call if I needed anything during the party. At 34 weeks pregnant, simple tasks had become strategic operations, but I was determined to be present for this celebration that my mother-in-law Catherine had so lovingly organized. The shower was being held at the community center in Laurelhurst Park, a charming venue with large windows overlooking the pond where families brought their children to feed ducks on lazy Sunday afternoons. Catherine had decorated the space in soft pastels, with flower arrangements that smelled like spring and tables laden with delicate finger foods that looked too beautiful to eat. I arrived at 11:30, 30 minutes before the official start time, to find Catherine putting finishing touches on the gift table. She was the kind of woman who made everything look effortless while secretly planning every detail with military precision. Her silver hair was styled in a perfect bob, and she wore a navy dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and practical. "Oh, honey, you look radiant," she said, embracing me carefully around my expanded middle. "David was right to worry about you overdoing it today, but I can see you're glowing with excitement." Catherine had become more of a mother to me than my own had ever been. When David and I met during my residency at Oregon Health Sciences University, she'd welcomed me into their family with open arms, never making me feel like I had to earn my place or prove my worth. It was a stark contrast to the conditional acceptance I'd grown up with in my own family. Guests began arriving promptly at noon, filling the space with laughter and conversation. My college friends mixed easily with David's family members, creating the kind of warm atmosphere that made celebrations memorable. I settled into the designated chair of honor, watching people I cared about gather to celebrate Emma's upcoming arrival. My mother, Patricia, arrived precisely on time, dressed in the kind of understated beige outfit that allowed her to blend into any social situation without drawing attention. She'd driven down from Seattle that morning, making appropriate comments about the decorations and asking the right questions about my pregnancy. But there was something distant in her manner that I'd learned to recognize over the years. Mom had never been comfortable with emotional displays or situations that required her to be fully present. She preferred the safety of surface-level interactions, where she could perform the role of supportive mother without actually engaging with the messy reality of human relationships. It was a pattern that had defined our relationship since childhood. "The drive wasn't too bad," she said, settling into a chair near the gift table. "Though I did leave early to avoid traffic. You know how I feel about being late." Miranda arrived 20 minutes later, making an entrance that somehow managed to draw attention without appearing intentionally. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired with heels that clicked against the hardwood floor with the rhythm of someone accustomed to commanding respect through presence alone. At 38, Miranda had built a successful career as a corporate litigation attorney in Seattle, specializing in cases that required the kind of aggressive tactics that made opposing counsel nervous. She lived in a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that looked impressive in photographs but felt cold and unwelcoming in person. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, though she didn't sound particularly apologetic. "Last-minute client crisis that couldn't wait. You know how it is in my line of work." Miranda had a gift for making her professional demands sound more important than other people's personal milestones. It was a subtle form of one-upmanship that she'd perfected over the years, ensuring that even her presence at family events came with reminders of her success and indispensability. She surveyed the party with the practiced eye of someone who evaluated everything for strategic advantage. I could see her cataloging details: the guest list, the decorations, the gift table that suggested the kind of financial support Devitt and I had received from his family. Miranda had always been competitive, but pregnancy seemed to have amplified her need to establish hierarchy in every situation. "Everything looks lovely," she said to Catherine, though her tone suggested she was offering professional evaluation rather than genuine compliment. It was classic Miranda, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that her reservations were subtly communicated. The first hour of the party proceeded smoothly, with guests playing gentle games and sharing advice about motherhood that ranged from practical to hilarious. I opened gifts slowly, savoring each thoughtful present, while Emma kicked enthusiastically against my ribs, as if she was excited about the tiny clothes and soft blankets that would soon be hers. Miranda participated in the festivities with the kind of calculated engagement that suggested she was present in body but not spirit. She made appropriate comments about the gifts, laughed at the right moments during games, and asked polite questions about my pregnancy timeline, but there was something performative about her involvement that made me increasingly uncomfortable. During the diaper cake cutting ceremony, while I was carefully removing decorative ribbons and exclaiming over the practical gifts hidden within the structure, Miranda positioned herself near the microphone that Catherine had set up for toasts and announcements. "I'd like to say something," Miranda announced, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used in courtrooms when she was about to present evidence that would devastate opposing arguments. The room gradually quieted as guests turned their attention towards her, expecting the kind of heartfelt sister speech that typically characterized baby shower celebrations. I looked up from the diaper cake, ribbons still in my hands, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach. Miranda had never been comfortable with sentimental moments, preferring to express affection through practical actions rather than emotional declarations. But something in her posture suggested that whatever she was planning to say would be far from the warm sisterly blessing that guests were anticipating. "I've been thinking a lot about responsibility lately," Miranda began, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on me with laser focus. The phrasing was careful and measured, the kind of language she used when building legal arguments that would be difficult to challenge directly. But there was an undertone of criticism that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this speech was heading somewhere unexpectedly. "Adeline has always been the free spirit in our family," Miranda continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when explaining complex legal concepts to clients she considered intellectually inferior. "The one who follows her heart rather than her head, who makes decisions based on emotion rather than careful planning." I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger as I realized where this was heading. Miranda was using my baby shower, in front of all these people who cared about me, to deliver some kind of public critique of my character and decision-making abilities. Catherine looked horrified, clearly wanting to intervene, but uncertain how to stop what was happening without creating an even bigger scene. My mother sat frozen in her chair, her face carefully blank in the way it became when family conflicts threatened to disrupt the surface harmony she worked so hard to maintain. "While those qualities can be charming in a young woman," Miranda continued, "they become concerning when that woman is about to become responsible for a helpless infant who will depend entirely on her judgment and stability for survival." The room had gone completely silent now, with guests staring in disbelief at what was unfolding. Several people looked toward the exits, as if considering whether they should leave rather than witness what was clearly becoming a family crisis played out in public. I sat in my chair of honor, 8 months pregnant and surrounded by baby gifts, feeling utterly exposed and humiliated as my sister systematically dismantled my character in front of everyone who had come to celebrate my upcoming motherhood. The ribbons in my hands felt like mockery now, symbols of joy and anticipation that had been transformed into props in Miranda's courtroom drama. I love my sister, Miranda said, though her tone suggested obligation rather than affection, which is why I feel compelled to express concerns that others might be too polite to voice. Concerns about whether someone with Adeline's history of impulsive decisions and emotional instability is truly prepared for the demands of parenthood. The words hit like physical blows, each accusation designed to strike at insecurities I'd struggled with throughout my pregnancy. The fear that I wasn't ready, that I'd make mistakes, that I'd somehow damage this precious life I was carrying. Miranda had identified my deepest anxieties and weaponized them in the most public, humiliating way possible. David's Aunt Sarah, a retired nurse who had raised 4 children of her own, finally broke the stunned silence. Miranda, I think perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place for... Actually, Miranda interrupted, her voice gaining strength as she warms to her theme, I think this is exactly the right time and place, before it's too late for rational people to intervene in a situation that could have devastating consequences for an innocent child. The implication was clear and devastating. Miranda wasn't just questioning my parenting abilities. She was suggesting that people should actively work to prevent me from raising my own daughter. In front of 30 witnesses, she was building a case for why I was unfit to be a mother. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The silence that followed Miranda's devastating accusation stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could feel 30 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting to see how I would respond to my sister's public character assassination. My hands instinctively moved to my belly, where Emma was kicking frantically, as if she could sense the tension radiating through my body. Catherine was the first to recover, rising from her chair with the dignified grace of a woman who had spent decades managing social crises. Perhaps we should focus on celebrating this wonderful occasion, she suggested, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. There will be plenty of time for family discussions later. But Miranda wasn't finished. She had the floor and an audience, and years of courtroom experience had taught her to press her advantage when opponents were vulnerable. I realize this is uncomfortable, she continued, adjusting her posture in a way that made her appear even more authoritative. But sometimes love requires difficult conversations. My college friend Jessica, who had known me since we were 18 and struggling through organic chemistry together, stood up abruptly. I think I've heard enough, she said, her voice shaking with anger. Adeline is going to be an amazing mother, and anyone who knows her can see that. Several other guests murmured agreement, but Miranda dismissed their support with the kind of dismissive gesture she probably used when opposing counsel presented weak evidence. Of course her friends are loyal, she said, but friendship doesn't qualify someone to assess parenting readiness. I finally found my voice, though it came out smaller and shakier than I'd intended. Miranda, what are you doing? This is supposed to be a celebration. I'm being honest, she replied, her tone suggesting that honesty was a virtue I was incapable of appreciating. Something this family has never been particularly good at. We enable each other's poor decisions and then act surprised when there are consequences. The accusation expanded beyond me to include everyone present, suggesting that my entire support system was complicit in some kind of collective delusion about my fitness for motherhood. It was a masterful courtroom tactic designed to isolate me from potential allies by questioning their judgment as well. Patricia, who had remained silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up with the kind of careful diplomacy she'd perfected over decades of avoiding family conflicts. Girls, perhaps we should discuss this privately. This isn't really the appropriate venue for. When is the appropriate venue, Mom? Miranda interrupted, her voice rising slightly. When she's already brought a child into an unstable situation. When is it too late to prevent potential damage? The phrase potential damage hung in the air like an accusation waiting to be proven. Miranda was speaking about my unborn daughter as if she was already a victim of neglect that hadn't yet occurred, creating a narrative where intervention was not just justified, but morally necessary. David's cousin Maria, who worked as a social worker and had seen actual cases of child endangerment, looked genuinely disturbed by the direction of Miranda's speech. I don't think anyone here is qualified to make assessments about parenting fitness based on personal opinions, she said carefully. There are trained professionals and established protocols for those kinds of evaluations. Miranda's eyes lit up at this comment, as if Maria had inadvertently provided her with the perfect segue to whatever point she was building toward. Exactly, she said, her voice taking on the triumphant tone she used when witnesses confirmed key elements of her legal arguments. I felt ice-cold dread settle in my stomach as I began to understand where this was leading. Miranda wasn't just delivering a spontaneous speech about her concerns. This was a calculated presentation with specific objectives, and she was working towards some kind of predetermined conclusion. Which is why, Miranda continued, reaching into her designer purse and pulling out what appeared to be official documentation, I've already taken the liberty of contacting Child Protective Services to express my concerns about this situation. The room erupted. Several guests gasped audibly. Catherine's face went white with shock, and my mother actually stood up for the first time during the entire confrontation, her careful composure finally cracking. You did what? I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the buzzing in my ears. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the full implications of what Miranda had done. I filed a report, Miranda said, her tone suggesting she was proud of her initiative. I documented your history of impulsive behavior, your financial instability during medical school, your pattern of making emotional decisions without considering long-term consequences. Someone needs to advocate for this child's welfare. Jessica was on her feet now, her face flushed with anger. You reported your own sister to CPS at her baby shower? What is wrong with you? Other guests were beginning to gather their belongings, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing what had devolved from a celebration into a family crisis of unprecedented proportions. The beautiful party that Catherine had planned so carefully was disintegrating as people tried to escape the toxic atmosphere Miranda had created. I reported a concerning situation to the appropriate authorities, Miranda corrected, her legal training evident in her careful word choice, the same thing any responsible citizen would do when they observed potential risk to a child's welfare. Catherine moved to my side, her hand settling gently on my shoulder in a gesture of support that felt like the only anchor keeping me from completely falling apart. But I couldn't move. I was 8 months pregnant, sitting in a room full of baby gifts that now felt like evidence in some kind of trial I didn't even know I was facing. My sister had just announced that she'd reported me to Child Protective Services, effectively accusing me of being an unfit mother before my daughter was even born. On what grounds? Maria asked, her professional experience clearly helping her process the situation more clearly than the rest of us. Miranda consulted her documentation with the efficiency of someone reading from prepared notes. Emotional instability, evidenced by her decision to quit a lucrative residency program to pursue family medicine in a small practice. Financial irresponsibility, demonstrated by her student loan debt and decision to buy a house in an expensive neighborhood despite limited income. Impulsive decision-making, including her choice to become pregnant without adequate preparation or planning. Each accusation was a twisted version of decisions I'd made based on my values and priorities, choosing family medicine over cardiology because I wanted to help underserved communities rather than maximize income, buying a home in a neighborhood with good schools because we were planning for our future family, getting pregnant when we felt emotionally and financially ready, even if we weren't wealthy by Miranda's standards. Those aren't grounds for a CPS investigation, Maria said firmly. Those are personal choices that fall well within the range of normal family planning decisions. According to you, Miranda replied, but CPS will make that determination based on objective criteria and professional assessment. I simply provided them with factual information concerning patterns of behavior. David's Uncle Robert, who rarely spoke at family gatherings, cleared his throat and addressed Miranda directly. Young lady, I've known your sister for 6 years, and I've watched her care for patients, support her husband, and prepare for motherhood with more dedication and thoughtfulness than most people bring to any aspect of their lives. What you're describing isn't factual information, it's a character assassination. The support from David's family was touching, but it also highlighted how isolated I was from my own family's backing. My mother remained silent, clearly paralyzed by a conflict she couldn't diplomatically resolve. Miranda stood her ground with unwavering confidence, and I sat in the middle, pregnant and vulnerable, feeling like I was defending my worthiness to raise my own child. The investigation will speak for itself, Miranda said, gathering her papers and preparing to leave. Either my concerns are valid, in which case intervention is necessary for the child's protection, or they're not, in which case the case will be closed with no harm done. No harm done? Catherine's voice carried a level of outrage I'd never heard from her before. You've humiliated your sister at her baby shower, disrupted a family celebration, and subjected a pregnant woman to the stress of a government investigation. How exactly is that no harm done? Miranda paused at the door, turning back to survey the wreckage of what had been a joyful celebration. For just a moment, something flickered across her face that might have been regret or uncertainty, but it was quickly replaced by the cold resolve that had carried her through years of legal battles. Sometimes protecting people requires making difficult decisions, she said, even when those people don't appreciate the protection. She left without saying goodbye, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor with the same authoritative rhythm that had announced her arrival. But now the sound felt ominous rather than impressive, like the countdown to some kind of disaster that was already in motion. The room remained silent for several minutes after her departure, as if no one knew how to process what had just occurred. Guests who had come to celebrate new life and family joy were instead witnesses to a calculated attack that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of what they thought they knew about family loyalty and love. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice gentle but determined. Everyone, I think we should wrap up for today. Adeline needs some time to process this, and frankly, so do the rest of us. As people gathered their belongings and offered awkward words of support, I remained in my chair, one hand on my belly and the other clutching the baby gift I'd been opening when Miranda began her assault. Emma continued kicking, and I found myself wondering if she could sense that the world she was about to enter had suddenly become much more complicated and dangerous than her parents had planned. David arrived home from his shift to find me sitting on our living room floor, surrounded by unopened baby shower gifts and sobbing uncontrollably. The sight of his wife, 8 months pregnant and clearly in distress, triggered every protective instinct he'd developed during 12 years as a first responder. He was beside me in seconds, his hands gentle but firm as he helped me to the couch. What happened? Is it the baby? Do we need to go to the hospital? Through broken sentences and hiccuping tears, I managed to explain Miranda's public attack and the revelation about the CPS report. I watched David's expression shift from concern to confusion to a cold fury that I'd rarely seen in our 6 years of marriage. He was the kind of man who stayed calm during emergencies, but this wasn't a fire or medical crisis he could solve with training and equipment. This was a deliberate attack on his family by someone who was supposed to love us. She filed a report before the party? David asked, his voice carefully controlled in the way it became when he was processing critical information. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. She planned this. The calculated nature of Miranda's actions made them even more devastating. She hadn't lost her temper or spoken out of momentary frustration. She'd systematically built a case against me, filed official complaints, and then used my baby shower as a platform to announce her actions to our entire social circle. David pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. I'm calling my brother. Jake knows family law, and we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Jake Morrison was David's older brother, a family attorney who specialized in custody cases and adoption proceedings. He'd built his practice on helping families navigate complex legal situations, often dealing with CPS investigations and child welfare proceedings. If anyone could help us understand the process and our rights, it would be him. While David made the call, I found myself staring at the baby gifts that Catherine had helped me load into the car after the disastrous party. Each wrapped package represented someone's excitement about Emma's arrival, but now they felt like reminders of how quickly joy could be transformed into fear and uncertainty. Emma was moving constantly in my belly, her kicks more frequent and forceful than usual. I wondered if she could sense my stress, if the adrenaline and cortisol flooding my system were affecting her development. The thought that Miranda's actions might be harming my unborn daughter added another layer of anguish to an already overwhelming situation. David finished his call and returned to the couch with information that was both reassuring and concerning. Jake says CPS has to investigate any report they receive, even if the allegations seem baseless. But he also says that Miranda's accusations, as you described them, don't constitute grounds for emergency intervention or removal. What does that mean exactly? I asked, trying to focus on practical details rather than the emotional trauma of being reported by my own sister. It means they'll likely schedule an interview with us, possibly a home visit, and they'll evaluate the claims against established criteria for child welfare concerns. Jake says the process can take several weeks, but unless there's evidence of immediate danger, they won't take any action before Emma is born. The idea of strangers coming into our home to evaluate our fitness as parents felt invasive and humiliating, but it was better than the alternative scenarios my imagination had been creating. At least we would have time to prepare and present our case effectively. There's something else, David continued, his expression growing more serious. Jake asked some specific questions about Miranda's motivations and her own family situation. He said false reports sometimes reveal more about the person making them than the people being reported. Over the next 3 days, while we waited for CPS to contact us, David and I began what felt like preparing for the most important job interview of our lives. We organized financial documents, gathered character references, and documented our preparation for parenthood in ways that we'd never thought would be necessary. Dr. Patricia Henley, my obstetrician, provided a letter stating that my pregnancy had progressed normally and that I'd followed all medical recommendations. She noted that I'd asked thoughtful questions about child development and had demonstrated thorough preparation for Emma's arrival. The letter felt like validation that I wasn't the irresponsible person Miranda had portrayed. Catherine wrote a detailed character reference describing the 6 years she'd known me, highlighting specific examples of my reliability, compassion, and dedication to family. She mentioned how I'd cared for David during his recovery from a job-related injury, my volunteer work at the community clinic, and my thoughtful approach to preparing for motherhood. My colleagues at the family practice where I worked provided similar documentation, emphasizing my professionalism, emotional stability, and excellent rapport with pediatric patients. Dr. Marcus Webb, the practice owner, wrote that he'd specifically recruited me because of my clinical skills and my natural ability to connect with children and families. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the baby shower, CPS caseworker Linda Thompson called to schedule our initial interview. Her voice was professional but not unkind, and she explained that this was a routine part of their investigation process. We arranged to meet at our home the following Tuesday afternoon. "What should we expect?" I asked, my hand unconsciously moving to my belly where Emma was performing her morning gymnastics routine. "I'll need to speak with both of you about the allegations, tour your home, and review the documentation you've prepared," Linda explained. "The goal is to assess whether there are any legitimate child welfare concerns that require ongoing monitoring or intervention." After the call ended, David and I spent the weekend making sure our house met whatever standards CPS might apply. We installed the car seat and double-checked that our nursery setup met current safety guidelines. We organized our financial records and created a timeline of our pregnancy preparation that demonstrated careful planning and responsible decision-making. But the most important conversation happened on Sunday evening when David's family gathered for their weekly dinner and the topic inevitably turned to Miranda's actions and the ongoing CPS investigation. Jake had joined us specifically to discuss the legal implications and help us understand our options. The investigation itself is standard procedure, he explained over Catherine's homemade lasagna, but I've been doing some research into Miranda's background, and there are some interesting patterns. He pulled out a legal pad covered with notes and observations. Miranda has been involved in 3 separate custody disputes over the past 5 years, always on the side arguing for child removal or custody modification. She's developed a reputation among family court judges for bringing cases with minimal evidence and maximum drama. This was news to all of us. Miranda had never mentioned involvement in custody cases, though her litigation practice was broad enough to include family law matters. But Jake's research suggested a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond her attack on me. "There's more," Jake continued. "I reached out to a colleague who handled cases where Miranda was opposing counsel. She's known for making personal attacks on parents' character rather than focusing on documented evidence of neglect or abuse. It's effective in creating doubt, but it doesn't always hold up under scrutiny." David's father, Robert, who had defended me at the baby shower, looked grim. "So she's done this before? Attacked other families?" "It appears so. And here's what's really interesting. In 2 of those cases, the parents she was attacking ended up filing counter-complaints about the people who had hired her. One case resulted in the removal of children from her client's home after it was discovered that the accusations were projection. The word projection hung in the air with ominous implications. Jake was suggesting that Miranda's attacks on other parents might have been attempts to deflect attention from problems and situations she was involved with. If that pattern held true for her attack on me, it raised disturbing questions about what might be happening in her own life. "What kind of counter-complaints?" Catherine asked, though her expression suggested she was already anticipating an unpleasant answer. Jake consulted his notes again. "Neglect, abandonment, inappropriate supervision of minors. In one case, the client Miranda was representing lost custody of their own children after the investigation revealed that the accusations against the other parent were actually descriptions of what was happening in the client's home." The implications were staggering. If Miranda was following a pattern of attacking other families to distract from problems in her own sphere, then her assault on my parenting fitness might be a projection of concerns about her own situation or that of people she was close to. "Does Miranda have children?" David asked, though we all knew the answer was no. "Not directly," Jake replied carefully, "but she does have guardianship of her boyfriend's teenage daughter while he's deployed overseas. And according to court records, there have been some issues with that arrangement." This was the first any of us had heard about Miranda having responsibility for a teenager. She'd never mentioned a boyfriend, let alone a guardianship situation that would make her legally responsible for a child's welfare. The secrecy around this arrangement was itself suspicious, especially given her very public attacks on my parenting readiness. "What kind of issues?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that the answer would explain a lot about Miranda's recent behavior. Jake's expression was grave as he delivered information that would change everything we thought we knew about my sister's motivations. Truancy, declining grades, reports of a teenager left unsupervised for extended periods, the kind of issues that typically trigger CPS investigations when they're brought to official attention. The room fell silent as we processed this revelation. Miranda, who had attacked me for supposedly being unfit to parent, was apparently struggling with her own parenting responsibilities in ways that might actually warrant the kind of official intervention she'd tried to direct at me. But the most disturbing implication was that her attack on me might not have been about protecting my unborn daughter at all. It might have been about creating a distraction from her own failures and redirecting scrutiny that was already heading in her direction. The CPS interview with Linda Thompson took place on a crisp Tuesday afternoon that felt charged with the kind of nervous energy that precedes life-changing moments. David had taken the day off from the fire station, and we'd spent the morning making final preparations for what felt like an examination of our worthiness to raise our own child. Linda arrived precisely on time, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she'd seen every possible family situation over her 2 decades in child protective services. She carried a leather portfolio and wore practical clothing that looked professional but approachable. "I appreciate you making time for this meeting," she said, as we settled in our living room. "I know this process can feel invasive, but my goal is simply to assess the situation and determine whether there are any legitimate welfare concerns." Her tone was neutral and professional, neither accusatory nor dismissive. Linda explained that she'd already reviewed Miranda's written complaint and had some specific questions about the allegations, but she also wanted to understand our perspective and see our home environment. "The report mentions concerns about financial instability," Linda began, consulting her notes. "Can you walk me through your current financial situation and your plans for supporting a child?" David and I had prepared extensively for this question. We provided documentation of our income, savings, health insurance coverage, and the detailed budget we'd created for Emma's expenses. David's salary as a firefighter was stable and included excellent benefits, while my income from the family practice provided additional security and flexibility. "We're not wealthy," I explained, "but we've been careful about planning for this baby. We've saved for maternity leave, we have a college fund, and we've made sure our health insurance will cover all of Emma's medical needs." Linda reviewed our documentation thoroughly, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her familiarity with the financial realities of raising children. Her questions were informed and practical, focusing on our ability to provide for Emma's basic needs rather than our lifestyle choices or spending priorities. "The report also mentions emotional instability and impulsive decision-making," Linda continued. "Can you help me understand what these concerns might be based on?" This was more challenging territory because Miranda's accusations were based on her interpretation of decisions we'd made based on our values and priorities. I explained my choice to pursue family medicine instead of a more lucrative specialty, our decision to buy a home in a good school district despite the higher cost, and our choice to start our family when we felt emotionally and financially ready. "These sound like thoughtful decisions based on your priorities," Linda observed. "Has anyone expressed concerns about your emotional stability or decision-making abilities in professional settings?" We provided letters from my medical colleagues, David's supervisors at the fire department, and our family physician. Every reference emphasized our reliability, professional competence, and sound judgment in both personal and professional contexts. Linda spent nearly an hour touring our home, paying particular attention to the nursery we'd prepared for Emma. She examined the crib setup, checked that we'd installed safety latches and outlet covers, and reviewed the baby-proofing measures we'd already implemented. Her assessment was thorough but not intrusive, and she seemed genuinely impressed with our preparation. "You've clearly put considerable thought into creating a safe environment for your daughter," she noted, examining the infant car seat we'd installed and the emergency contact information we'd posted near the phone. As the interview progressed, Linda's questions became more pointed about Miranda herself and the nature of our family relationship. She asked about the circumstances surrounding the report, the public nature of Miranda's accusations, and whether there had been previous conflicts between us. "In my experience," Linda said carefully, "reports from family members often reflect complicated dynamics that extend beyond the immediate concerns being expressed. Can you help me understand your sister's motivations for making this report?" This was the opening we'd been waiting for. David and I exchanged glances before I began explaining Jake's research into Miranda's background and her pattern of involvement in custody cases. We provided documentation of her history of making similar accusations against other families, always in situations where she later faced scrutiny herself. "My brother-in-law discovered that Miranda currently has guardianship of a teenage girl," I explained, "and apparently there've been some issues with that arrangement that might warrant the kind of investigation she's trying to initiate against us." Linda's expression shifted subtly, her professional interest clearly piqued by this information. She made several notes before asking for specific details about Miranda's guardianship situation and the problems Jake had uncovered. What kind of issues are we talking about? David consulted the documentation Jake had provided. Chronic truancy, failing grades, reports from neighbors about a teenager being left alone for days at a time while the guardian travels for work. The kind of neglect that typically triggers mandatory reporting from school officials. And you believe your sister filed this report as a way of deflecting attention from her own situation? Lynn asked.
It's a pattern, I said. According to court records, she's done this before. Attack other families when her own situation is about to come under scrutiny. Linda was quiet for several minutes, reviewing her notes and the documentation we'd provided. Finally, she closed her portfolio and looked at both of us directly. Based on this interview and my assessment of your home environment, I see no evidence supporting the allegations in your sister's report, she said. You appear to be well prepared, financially stable, and emotionally ready for parenthood. I'll be recommending that this case be closed with no further action required. The relief was overwhelming, but Linda wasn't finished. However, she continued, the information you've provided about your sister's guardianship situation is concerning. If there are legitimate welfare issues with a minor in her care, that's something we need to investigate. She asked for all the documentation Jake had gathered about Miranda's guardianship of 15-year-old Sophia Chen, whose father was deployed with the army in South Korea. The arrangement had been informal initially, but legal guardianship had been established 6 months ago when Sophia's father's deployment was extended. I'll need to open a separate investigation based on this information, Linda explained. The issues you've described constitute potential neglect, and we have a legal obligation to assess any situation where a minor's welfare may be at risk. 3 days later, Jake called with news that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. CPS is opening a formal investigation into Miranda's guardianship of Sophia Chen, he reported. And it gets worse. The school district has been documenting problems for months, but hadn't reported them because they thought the issues were temporary adjustment problems. What kind of problems? David asked, putting the call on speaker so I could hear. Sophia's been absent 43 days this semester. Her grades have dropped from A's and B's to mostly F's. Teachers report that she often appears tired and hungry, wearing the same clothes multiple days in a row. And here's the kicker. Miranda's been telling the school that Sophia has emotional problems stemming from her father's deployment, when actually the problem started after she moved in with Miranda. The picture Jake was painting was of a teenager whose life had deteriorated dramatically since coming under Miranda's care. The same person who had publicly questioned my fitness to parent was apparently failing at her own parenting responsibilities in ways that were documented and observable. There's more, Jake continued. I spoke with Miranda's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who's been keeping an informal eye on Sophia. She says Miranda travels frequently for work, leaving Sophia alone for days at a time with minimal supervision. And here's the kicker. Miranda's been telling the school that Sophia has emotional problems stemming from her father's deployment, when actually the problem started after she moved in with Miranda. The picture Jake was painting was of a teenager whose life had deteriorated dramatically since coming under Miranda's care. The same person who had publicly questioned my fitness to parent was apparently failing at her own parenting responsibilities in ways that were documented and observable. There's more, Jake continued. I spoke with Miranda's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who's been keeping an informal eye on Sophia. She says Miranda travels frequently for work, leaving Sophia alone for days at a time with minimal supervision. The girl's been ordering food delivery and doing her own laundry because there's no adult present to help her. The irony was devastating. Miranda had attacked me for supposedly being unprepared for motherhood, while she was actively neglecting a teenager who depended on her for basic care and supervision. The projection theory that Jake had suggested was proving accurate in ways that were both vindicating and heartbreaking. What happens now? I asked. CPS will interview Sophia, her teachers, the neighbors, and Miranda herself. If they find evidence of neglect, they'll either require Miranda to comply with a safety plan, or they'll remove Sophia from her care and place her with relatives or in foster care. The thought of Sophia, a 15-year-old girl already dealing with her father's deployment, being failed by the adult who was supposed to protect her, was infuriating. Miranda's need to maintain her image as the successful, responsible sister had apparently blinded her to the actual responsibilities that came with caring for a vulnerable teenager. That evening, as David and I sat in Emma's nursery, putting together the last pieces of furniture we'd need for her arrival, my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Adeline, this is Sophia Chen. I got your number from my mom. I need to talk to someone, and I don't know who else to call." The voice was young and scared, with the kind of careful control that suggested someone trying very hard not to cry. This was the teenager whose welfare had become entangled with Miranda's attack on my family, and she was reaching out for help from people she barely knew because the adult responsible for her care had apparently failed her completely. "Of course, Sophia. What's wrong? Are you safe?" "I'm okay right now, but Miranda left for Seattle this morning and won't be back until Friday. She said she arranged for me to stay with her friend, but the friend never showed up. I've been alone since yesterday. I don't know what to do." The situation was exactly what Linda Thompson would need to document Miranda's neglect. A 15-year-old girl left alone for days with adequate supervision and support, forced to reach out to virtual strangers because the person legally responsible for her welfare had abandoned her responsibilities. But at that moment, the legal implications mattered less than the fact that a scared teenager needed help from adults who actually cared about her safety and well-being. "Sophia, stay exactly where you are," I told her, already reaching for my jacket while David grabbed his keys. "We're coming to get you right now." The 15-minute drive to Miranda's downtown condo felt like hours. Every protective instinct I developed during my pregnancy was now focused on a teenager who had been abandoned by the same person who'd questioned my fitness to be a mother. The irony was bitter, but my immediate concern was getting Sophia to safety. Miranda's building was one of those sleek glass towers that looked impressive from the outside but felt cold and impersonal once you were inside. Sophia was waiting in the lobby, a slight girl with dark hair and intelligent eyes that looked far too old for her 15 years. She carried a backpack that appeared to contain everything she considered essential, suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd been left to fend for herself. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I didn't know who else to call. Miranda said her friend would check on me, but..." She shrugged, with the kind of resignation that comes from having adults repeatedly fail to keep their promises. During the drive back to our house, Sophia gradually opened up about her living situation with Miranda. The picture she painted was devastating. A teenager trying to maintain normalcy while being systematically neglected by an adult who was more concerned with maintaining appearances than providing actual care. "She's gone a lot for work," Sophia explained, staring out the car window. "Sometimes just overnight, but lately it's been 3 or 4 days at a time. She leaves money for food delivery and tells me to handle things because I'm mature for my age."
The phrase, "mature for my age," was a red flag that any child welfare professional would recognize. It was the justification adults used when they were placing inappropriate responsibilities on children, expecting them to function independently in situations where they needed supervision and support. "What about school?" David asked gently. "Have you been able to keep up with your classes?" Sophia's laugh was hollow and bitter. "I've missed so much school that my teachers stopped expecting me to show up. Miranda writes excuses saying I have anxiety issues from my dad's deployment, but really I just can't get there consistently when she's traveling and doesn't leave transportation arrangements." The pattern was becoming clear. Miranda had created a narrative that blamed Sophia's problems on emotional issues, rather than acknowledging her own failure to provide basic care and supervision. It was the same strategy she'd used when attacking me, creating stories that deflected responsibility while maintaining her image as the reasonable, competent adult. Once we got Sophia settled in our guest room with some of Catherine's homemade soup and clean clothes that David had grabbed from his donation bag, I called Linda Thompson to report the immediate abandonment situation. Her response was swift and decisive. I'll need to document this incident and speak with Sophia directly, Linda said. Can you bring her to my office tomorrow morning? And I'll need to contact Miranda immediately to understand why she left a minor in her care without adequate supervision. She's in Seattle on business, I explained. She told Sophia she'd be back Friday, but the supervision she arranged never materialized. That's a serious violation of her guardianship responsibilities, Linda replied. I'll be issuing an emergency order requiring Miranda to return immediately and explain the situation. If she can't provide adequate justification, we'll need to consider alternative placement for Sophia. That evening, while Sophia did homework at our kitchen table with the focused determination of someone trying to catch up on weeks of missed assignments, my phone rang. Miranda's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach despite everything that had changed since our last conversation. "Where is she?" Miranda demanded without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Where is Sophia?" "She's safe," I replied, moving to the living room where I could speak without Sophia overhearing. "Which is more than I can say about the situation you left her in." "I arranged for supervision," Miranda snapped. "Jennifer was supposed to check on her. If she didn't follow through, that's not my fault." The deflection was classic Miranda. Blame anyone and everyone except herself for the consequences of her own poor planning and inadequate care. But there was something different in her voice now, a desperate edge that suggested she was beginning to understand the seriousness of her situation. "Jennifer never showed up," I said. "Sophia has been alone since Tuesday, ordering food delivery and handling everything by herself. She called me because she didn't know what else to do." There was a long pause before Miranda spoke again, her voice smaller and less certain. "She's 15. She's capable of handling a few days on her own." "No, Miranda, she's not. She's a 15-year-old girl whose father is deployed overseas and who depends on you for care and supervision. Leaving her alone for days isn't independence training, it's abandonment." The legal terminology seemed to penetrate Miranda's defenses in a way that emotional arguments hadn't. As an attorney, she understood the implications of words like abandonment in the context of child welfare proceedings. "I'm driving back tonight," she said, though her tone suggested this was a concession rather than a choice. "I'll pick her up in the morning." "Actually, you won't," I replied, feeling a surge of protective anger. "CPS has issued an emergency order requiring you to report to their office immediately when you return. Sophia will stay with us until they determine whether it's safe for her to return to your care." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of Miranda's recognition that her attack on my family had backfired spectacularly. The sister who had publicly questioned my parenting fitness was now facing the loss of her own guardianship responsibilities due to documented neglect. "This is temporary," Miranda said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "Once I explain the situation and make better arrangements for supervision, everything will go back to normal." "Miranda," I said gently, surprising myself with the compassion in my voice despite everything she'd put me through. "This isn't about making better arrangements. Sophia's life has been falling apart for months while you've been focused on your career and your public image. She needs stability and care, not better logistics." Miranda arrived at our house the next morning looking haggard and desperate, her usual polished appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and hair that suggested she'd driven through the night without stopping. She knocked on our door with the urgent rhythm of someone who was no longer in control of the situation. "I need to see Sophia," she said when I answered, her voice carrying a note of pleading that I'd never heard from her before. Sophia emerged from the kitchen where she'd been finishing breakfast with David, her expression carefully neutral as she faced the woman who was supposed to be caring for her. "Why didn't you call Jennifer when she didn't show up?" Miranda asked, her tone suggesting that Sophia should have solved the supervision problem herself. "I did call her," Sophia replied quietly, 3 times. She never answered, and her voicemail was full. I texted her too, but she never responded. The response deflated Miranda's attempt to blame the situation on Sophia's failure to communicate. It was clear that whatever arrangements Miranda thought she'd made had been inadequate from the beginning, leaving a 15-year-old to handle an adult's failure to follow through on basic responsibilities. I had important meetings in Seattle, Miranda said, her voice taking on the defensive tone she used when her professional priorities were questioned. I couldn't just cancel because of a miscommunication. You couldn't cancel, David said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd spent his career prioritizing other people's safety. But you could leave a teenager alone for days without reliable supervision? The contrast between David's approach to responsibility and Miranda's was stark. As a first responder, David understood that some obligations superseded personal convenience, especially when vulnerable people depended on you for their safety and well-being. I provided money for food and transportation, Miranda protested. She had everything she needed to be self-sufficient. Except supervision, support, and someone who cared about her well-being, I replied. Money isn't a substitute for actual parenting, Miranda. Sophia had been listening to this exchange with the careful attention of someone whose future was being decided by adults arguing about her needs and welfare. Finally, she spoke up with the quiet courage of someone who'd been forced to advocate for herself because no adult was consistently doing it for her. I don't want to go back, she said simply. I know you're trying to help, Miranda, but I can't keep living like this. I need to know that someone will be there when I need them, and you're never there when I need you. The words hit Miranda like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the justifications and rationalizations she'd built around her neglect of Sophia's needs. For the first time since I'd known her, Miranda looked genuinely shaken, as if she was finally seeing the real consequences of her actions. Sophia, I know I've made mistakes, Miranda said, her voice breaking slightly, but I can do better. I can arrange better supervision. I can travel less. You can make promises, Sophia interrupted gently, but you've made promises before, and they didn't help when I needed them. I need someone who puts me first sometimes, not someone who fits me around their other priorities. The assessment was devastating in its accuracy and maturity. Sophia had learned to see through adult promises to the patterns of behavior that revealed true priorities, and Miranda's pattern was clear: career first, image second, actual caregiving responsibilities a distant third. At that moment, Linda Thompson arrived for her scheduled interview with Sophia, her presence transforming our living room into an informal courtroom where Miranda's fitness as a guardian would be evaluated based on documented evidence rather than legal arguments or professional reputation. The reckoning that Miranda had tried to force on my family was finally arriving at her own doorstep, and this time there would be nowhere to hide from the consequences of her choices. Linda Thompson's interview with Sophia took place in our living room, with Miranda present but notably silent as the teenager she'd been responsible for calmly detailed months of neglect and abandonment. Sophia spoke with the kind of careful precision that suggested she'd been practicing these words in her head, knowing that this conversation would determine her future. I understand that Miranda travels for work, Linda said gently, but can you walk me through what happens when she's away? Sophia glanced at Miranda before speaking, then seemed to make a conscious decision to focus on honesty rather than protecting the adult who had failed to protect her. She usually leaves on Sunday or Monday and comes back Wednesday or Thursday, sometimes longer. She leaves money for food delivery and tells me to get myself to school, but the bus routes are complicated from downtown and I don't always have reliable transportation. What about homework help or support with school issues? I handle everything myself, replied. When teachers call about missed assignments or absences, I tell them Miranda is traveling and will call them back, but she usually doesn't, so the problems just get worse. Miranda shifted uncomfortably as Sophia methodically dismantled every excuse and justification she'd offered for her parenting approach. The teenager's testimony was devastating, precisely because it was delivered without anger or drama, just the factual recounting of a child who'd been forced to become self-sufficient because the responsible adult was consistently absent. How do you feel about your current living situation? Linda asked. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. I love my dad, and I know he's serving our country. I want to make him proud, but I also need someone who's actually present in my life, someone I can count on when things go wrong or when I need help. I haven't had that consistency with Miranda. The assessment was mature and heartbreaking, delivered by a 15-year-old who'd been forced to evaluate adult reliability because her survival depended on it. Miranda's face had gone pale as she listened to Sophia articulate the ways her guardianship had failed to meet even basic emotional and practical needs. "Miranda," Linda said, turning her attention to my sister, "how do you respond to Sophia's concerns about consistency and availability?" Miranda straightened in her chair, her attorney instincts kicking in as she prepared to defend her actions. "I've been balancing significant professional responsibilities with guardianship duties. I've provided financial support, housing, and educational opportunities. I may not have been physically present as much as ideal, but I've ensured that Sophia's material needs were met." "Material needs," Linda repeated thoughtfully. "What about emotional support, supervision, and guidance? What about being available when she's struggling with school or social issues?" "Sophia is mature for her age," Miranda replied, using the same phrase that had raised red flags earlier. "I've been encouraging her independence and self-reliance, which are valuable life skills." Linda made several notes before responding. "In my experience, 15-year-olds need independence within a framework of consistent adult support and supervision. Can you give me specific examples of how you've provided that framework?" The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Miranda's approach. She'd confused neglect with independence training, abandonment with character building. When pressed for concrete examples of guidance and support, she could only point to financial provisions and academic opportunities that meant little without emotional presence and reliability. "I think," Linda said after reviewing her notes, "we need to consider what arrangement would best serve Sophia's needs going forward. Miranda, your guardianship agreement requires you to provide not just material support, but active supervision and emotional guidance. Based on what I've observed and documented, that standard has been consistently met." The formal language carried devastating implications. Linda was essentially declaring Miranda unfit to continue as Sophia's guardian, using the same criteria that Miranda had tried to apply to my situation. The irony was complete. The person who'd attacked my parenting fitness was losing her own parenting responsibilities due to documented failures. "What are my options?" Sophia asked, her voice small but determined. Linda explained that emergency placement with relatives was preferred when possible, followed by carefully vetted foster care if family options weren't available. She also mentioned that Sophia's father would be contacted about the situation and given options for arranging alternative guardianship even while deployed. "Actually," I said, surprising everyone in the room, including myself, "David and I would like to be considered for temporary guardianship if Sophia is comfortable with that arrangement." The offer emerged from a place of genuine care that had developed over the past few days of watching Sophia navigate an impossible situation with grace and maturity. She was a remarkable teenager who deserved adults who would prioritize her welfare, and David and I found ourselves wanting to provide that stability. Sophia's eyes filled with tears for the first time during the entire interview. "Really? You'd want me to stay with you?" "We'd be honored," David said, moving to sit near Sophia in a gesture of support. "You've shown incredible strength and maturity, and we'd love to help you finish high school in a stable environment." Miranda looked stricken, finally understanding that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond the professional embarrassment she'd been worried about. She was losing guardianship of a teenager she'd grown to care about, even if she'd failed to express that care through consistent presence and support. "I know I made mistakes," Miranda said quietly, her voice lacking the confidence and authority that usually characterized her speech. "But I do care about Sophia. I wanted to do right by her." "Wanting isn't enough," Linda replied gently but firmly. "Guardianship requires consistent action, reliable presence, and prioritizing a child's needs above personal convenience. Those standards exist to protect children like Sophia." Over the following weeks, the legal processes moved forward with efficiency that suggested everyone involved recognized the urgency of Sophia's situation. Miranda's guardianship was formally terminated, and temporary custody was transferred to David and me pending approval from Sophia's father and completion of background checks. Sophia's father, Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, was granted emergency leave to visit and assess the new arrangement. His gratitude toward us was overwhelming, but his disappointment in Miranda was even more profound. He'd trusted his daughter's welfare to someone he'd believed was responsible and capable, only to discover that his trust had been misplaced. "I should have checked more carefully," he told us during his visit. "I should have insisted on more regular communication with Sophia instead of assuming everything was fine because Miranda's professional success suggested competence in other areas." The mistake was understandable but painful. Miranda's public image as a successful attorney had masked her private failures as a caregiver, creating a dangerous disconnect between appearance and reality that had nearly cost Sophia her educational and emotional stability. 3 weeks after the CPS investigation concluded, Emma decided to make her entrance into the world. Labor began at 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning, progressing quickly enough that David barely had time to arrange for Catherine to stay with Sophia before we rushed to the hospital. Emma Rose Morrison arrived at 6:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with dark hair like mine and David's determined chin. Holding her for the first time, I felt overwhelmed by protective love and gratitude that she was entering a world where she would be unconditionally welcomed and cherished. Sophia visited the hospital that afternoon, bringing a handmade card and a small stuffed elephant for Emma. Watching her hold my newborn daughter with careful tenderness, I realized that our family had expanded in ways we'd never anticipated. We were no longer just preparing to be parents to one child, we were providing stability and love to a teenager who needed it just as desperately. "She's beautiful," Sophia whispered, gently touching Emma's tiny fingers. "And she's so lucky to have parents who already love her this much." The comment reflected everything Sophia had been missing: the security of knowing that adults prioritized her welfare, the confidence that came from consistent care and attention. Watching her with Emma, I saw glimpses of the remarkable young woman she was becoming despite the challenges she'd faced.
Miranda came to the hospital the day before Emma and I were discharged, carrying flowers and wearing the kind of humble expression I'd never seen on her face before. The sister who had once attacked my parenting fitness was now asking permission to meet the niece she'd tried to have removed from my care. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, standing awkwardly near the door, as if unsure whether she was welcome. "Several apologies, actually." I looked at her holding flowers in a sterile hospital room, no longer the intimidating attorney who'd humiliated me at my baby shower, but someone who'd lost custody of a teenager due to her own failures while trying to question mine. The transformation was complete and humbling. "I know," I said simply, "and I accept them." "I don't expect forgiveness," Miranda continued. "I understand if you never trust me around Emma or want me involved in your family's life. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand how wrong I was about everything." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, with Miranda acknowledging the projection and fear that had driven her attack on my family. She'd been struggling with guardianship responsibilities she felt unprepared for, and instead of seeking help or admitting her limitations, she'd tried to deflect attention by questioning someone else's parenting readiness. "I thought if I could prove that even someone like you, someone everyone loves and respects, wasn't really ready for parenthood, then maybe my own struggles would seem normal," she admitted. It was twisted logic born from panic and pride. 6 months later, Sophia was thriving in our household. Her grades had improved dramatically, and she'd been accepted to several excellent colleges with plans to study social work. Her father's deployment was ending, but he'd asked us to continue providing stability through her senior year, recognizing that disrupting her life again would be counterproductive.
Miranda had entered therapy and was working to understand the patterns of behavior that had led to her failures as a guardian and sister. She'd also started volunteering with organizations that supported military families, channeling her legal skills toward helping people navigate custody and guardianship issues rather than creating them. Emma was developing into a happy, alert baby who seemed to thrive on the energy and attention of her multi-generational household. Sophia had become a devoted big sister figure, helping with feedings and diaper changes while maintaining her own academic and social commitments. The family that had emerged from the crisis was stronger, more inclusive, and more authentic than what we'd started with. We'd learned that love sometimes required protecting people from those who claimed to care about them, that projection often revealed more about accusers than their targets, and that the most profound growth sometimes emerged from the most painful conflicts. As I rocked Emma to sleep on a quiet evening, listening to Sophia and David discuss her college applications in the kitchen, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that devastating baby shower. The sister who tried to destroy my family had inadvertently led us to expand it, bringing Sophia into our lives and teaching us all valuable lessons about resilience, responsibility, and the true meaning of family loyalty. Sometimes the greatest gifts emerged from the most unexpected challenges, and sometimes the people who tried to tear you down ended up building you up in ways they never intended. Emma would grow up knowing that she was wanted, protected, and surrounded by people who chose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and healing over revenge. The war Miranda had declared on our family had ended not with victory or defeat, but with transformation and unexpected grace that changed all of us for the better. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.